as as the
Okay, let's get
message.
started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 6th Annual Forum on the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. We're very pleased to have a distinguished guest. I would like now to turn the program over to our President, Alexandria Maloney, for welcoming remarks. Alexandria.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to some, good evening to others. Welcome on behalf of Black Professionals in International Affairs. I'd just like to greet each and every one of you. This is our 6th annual Economic Outlook Forum, and we're very excited to hear from our guests today. So thank you for joining. If you haven't already, please consider joining BPIA as a member. So with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Cal. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandria. And thank you to everyone who is here today and to our distinguished panel. The panel is introduced in the biographies attached to the flyer that you received. The speakers in order of presentation will be Andrew Tiffin. He is the senior economist, and he is actually the lead writer, the lead of the team that prepared this year's report on the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. We also have Professor Landry Signy. He is executive director and professor of Thunderbird School of Management, and he's also a distinguished fellow at Brookings. And finally, we have Dr. Joy Katiwig. I'm sorry, I've practiced. She is the strategic advisor to the assistant administrator and regional director for the Regional Bureau of Africa, so in the United Nations Development Program. We are very, very pleased to have this distinguished panel with us today. Without further ado, I will introduce now Andrew Tiffin, who will present the report and findings of the IMF. Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Cal, and thank you everybody for joining us today and giving me an opportunity to talk with you all. See if I can share a screen here. Hopefully you can all see that. So the key topic today is the economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. I'd like to just spend a few moments right now outlining how we see the regional economy evolving, what are the main challenges for policymakers in the region, and the policy priorities that we at the fund see for the region going forward. So as you may know, we released our latest assessment for the region just last month. And this time, more than most, our outlook for Africa is shaped very much by the global economic environment that our region finds itself in. If you could see on the left chart, global growth has been marked down significantly, both for this year and especially next year. A main theme coming out of the annual meetings for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank this year was that this year, 2022, was disappointing. Next year will be worse. Next year, more than 1/3 of the world's economies will be in recession, and risks are still tilted to the downside. There's a 1 in 4 chance that global growth will dip below 2% next year. Now that sort of sounds relatively mild at first glance, but this has only happened 5 times since the 1970s. All right, so this would be actually something quite extraordinary. Also setting the stage for our assessment are global commodity prices, which matter a lot for our region, have been very volatile this year. For example, on the chart on the right, we see that wheat prices almost doubled in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine before coming down swiftly. But much of that volatility, much of those swings in commodity prices still persist, and we expect those to continue going forward in the coming year as well. So in addition to slow global growth, global inflation has also turned out to be higher and much more persistent than we had expected. And this in turn has caused a pickup in the pace of monetary policy tightening in most advanced economies. Now, for Africa, this is reflected in higher borrowing costs and much more volatile capital flows. In the first half of this year, capital outflows from sub-Saharan Africa were on a par with some of the most extreme episodes that we've seen over the past 10 years. For example, like the onset of the COVID shock or the 2015 commodity price shock, right? So again, capital flows for the region are also expected to be volatile going forward. So in a very difficult global international environment, regional imbalances have also been on the rise. Most notably, high inflation has returned for many of our countries, largely driven by recent increase in global food and energy prices. About 40% of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa now have double-digit inflation, which is something we've not seen in quite some time. And in addition to high inflation, fiscal positions have deteriorated significantly over the past few years. Public debt is now around 60% of GDP, and it's approaching levels that we last saw in the early 2000s, before the impact of the HIPC debt reduction initiative. The composition of debt has also changed. If I were to compare the situation in 2000 with today, low-cost, long-term multilateral debt has been replaced with high-cost private funding, including Eurobonds and domestic debt, which leaves many of our countries a lot more exposed to rising debt service costs, rising borrowing costs, and to higher rollover risks. Furthermore, right now, for the 35 low-income countries that we have in our region, 19 of those are either in debt distress or at high risk of distress right now. So just briefly, in terms of headline numbers, with all these global shocks and with rising regional imbalances, we expect growth to slow by more than 1 percentage point this year in 2022, from 4.7% last year to about 3.6% this year. And we expect that subdued level of growth to continue going into next year as well, again, in line with what we're seeing in the global economy. So with this outlook, many of our policymakers in Africa will find themselves once again in a very difficult position. In the current environment, and with depleted buffers and shrinking policy space, we see policymakers looking to meet 3 different broad policy objectives. The first we sort of characterize as fighting fires. As always, for policymakers, the first priority is to save lives. So authorities need to address social or humanitarian crises as they arise. And right now, in sub-Saharan Africa, the most pressing issue is food insecurity. The second broad objective is building resilience. Another one of the themes that came out of the annual meetings this year for the World Bank and the IMF is that we seem to be moving into a much more volatile world, with larger and larger shocks coming more and more frequently. And so building a resilient economy, building an economy that can withstand these kinds of shocks requires restoring buffers as you can, and also strengthening our policy frameworks. And the last broad objective is what we call sort of moving away from the edge. Now, ultimately, the best way of reducing imbalances is to restore economic growth, is to restore incomes. But they're suggesting that the need for upfront structural reforms, upfront growth enhancing reforms, they're needed now more than ever. So with all that in mind, our report outlines what we see as the region's 4 most pressing policy priorities right now. Okay, the first priority is to address the current food crisis. By the end of this year, by the end of 2022, at least 123 million people in our region, almost 12% of the population, will be acutely food insecure. And about a third of those have become insecure just over the past 2 years since the onset of the COVID pandemic. And most recently, that's been made worse by rising food and energy prices. Now, dealing with rising global prices for essentials like food and fuel, the textbook solution is usually to allow global prices to feed into local prices and then to protect the most vulnerable using a separate channel, basically either through targeted cash transfers or by expanding social safety nets. Now, one of the things that has come up in our discussions with the authorities, and one of the things that we highlight in our report, is that this response is often not feasible for many of our countries, at least not in the short term. Much of our region, much of Sub-Saharan Africa, has relatively limited administrative capacity or has large amounts of the workforce in the informal sector, which makes it difficult to scale up social security or assistance programs at the pace or of the size that's often needed. So what we have seen instead is that many countries have resorted to short-term measures that are untargeted. Things like tax cuts on food and fuel, things like subsidies on food and fuel, and measures like that. We understand that these kinds of measures may be necessary in an emergency. Again, the priority is to save lives, but part of our advice is that these kinds of measures should be gradually phased out and replaced with better targeted alternatives that allocate resources to those who need them most. The priority is perhaps not so urgent on food subsidies and measures, but on fuel subsidies. This is something that we know from experience can get very expensive very quickly. In essence, fuel subsidies are an untargeted measure so that in our effort to protect the poor, we're also subsidizing the consumption of the rich. And as they become more and more expensive over time, it shrinks the resources available for our authorities to address other needs like health or education. So again, our advice is that these types of subsidies in particular should be phased out over time to free up resources to help authorities help the people who need help the most. The second policy priority that we see is the need to strengthen public finances. Fiscal policy was generally supportive throughout the pandemic, and appropriately so in our view. But with rising debt, and particularly in a global environment of rising borrowing costs, public finances throughout the region are under strain. Now, some countries still have some fiscal space remaining, and in those cases, our advice is that they should continue basically to use that space to keep on investing in human and physical capital. But a majority of the countries in Africa have high debt vulnerabilities right now, and they do need to consolidate their public finances. In general, ongoing consolidation will involve continuing efforts to raise more revenue, also perhaps to prioritize spending, or perhaps to seek areas of efficiency where you can get the same output for less money. But in the current environment, we're also stressing that these efforts might be complemented by a more credible and transparent medium-term fiscal frameworks that can actually help improve trust in investors, and which can actually help keep borrowing costs low, especially in the current situation. Now, for most countries in our region, that should be enough. Adjustment needs are relatively moderate, and fiscal adjustment should be sufficient to both reduce debt while at the same time dealing with higher borrowing costs. But in some countries, in a few countries, adjustment needs are actually extremely large, and it's unlikely that consolidation alone will be enough to restore sustainability. So for those few cases, the necessary adjustment will need to be accompanied by some form of debt reprofiling or debt restructuring. And the fund is sort of is an ongoing effort to basically strengthen the international mechanisms in which that debt can be reprofiled or restructured. The third priority is to tackle inflation. Inflation, as we know, is effectively a pretty insidious tax, particularly on the poor. It hurts those who can protect themselves the least. And African countries face a particularly delicate challenge in managing monetary policies right now. As we can see from the chart on the right, countries have generally been tightening their monetary policy stance, raising interest rates over the past year. And in general, our advice is that they should continue to do this, but they should move very gradually and very cautiously, given that the recovery in the region is still very fragile and domestic demand pressures have not so far been the main driver of inflation. Instead, inflation is being driven by external factors like global food prices, global fuel prices. So on the one hand, they should move very cautiously when raising rates, but at the same time, they also need to worry about the risks of under-tightening, because some countries in our region, inflationary expectations are not well anchored, raising the prospect of a broader spread of inflation from simple food and energy prices to a broader range of prices across the entire economy. And as we know, again, inflation hurts the poor the most, and the costs of bringing inflation down are much, much higher once inflationary expectations become entrenched. The fourth priority is to foster sustainable and greener growth. Now, high quality growth has always been a policy priority for us at the fund, but the context for structural reform, the context for growth enhancing reform is changing dramatically right now, particularly in the context of accelerating climate change. More and more investment in green infrastructure is needed, both to capitalize on Africa's pretty sizable endowment of renewable resources, but also to potentially leapfrog some of the sort of more older fossil fuel-based growth models that we've seen applied elsewhere. Now, for countries with limited fiscal space, with limited ability to spend public funds in support of this effort, and given the scale of the region's climate and investment needs, public finances alone won't be sufficient. So leveraging private sector innovation, private sector activity, private sector investment, essentially, will be essential. But one of the messages that we also include is that, as well as the private sector, we also need a dramatic step up in international support, in international assistance, particularly to finance climate adaptation. And that's sort of the final wrap-up message of our report, and that international assistance, international support is crucial, not only to help support Africa's green transition, but also to help respond to the region's emergency food security and pandemic needs, and also to help countries maintain stability in the face of large global macro shocks of the kind that we've seen over the past 2 years. Now, on the part of the International Monetary Fund, we've provided about $27 billion in new financing over the past 2 years since the start of the pandemic. When we add the recent allocation of SDRs, which is a form of international liquidity, that sort of bumps up to about 50 billion in 2 years. So in just the past 2 years, we've actually provided more to the region than in any 10-year period since the 1970s. And we're not alone. A number of other institutions with us are stepping up. But our goal is not just to provide them the funding, the goal is also to catalyze other funding for other institutions and particularly the private sector. And sort of part of our effort is to do that with messaging. Part of our effort is also to do that with a much more flexible set of tools and lending facilities to help better meet the needs of the region. One of the things that we would perhaps advertise right now is we just opened what we're calling the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is our first long-term lending facility to help countries deal specifically with longer-term challenges like climate change. And most recently, we also had we opened an emergency food shock window under our emergency financing to help countries deal with the current food shock crisis. So that's yeah. So with that, I suspect I'm running out of time. I'd like to again thank you all once again for joining us today, and maybe turn over to the panel for discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This was very enlightening. I think I don't want to summarize except to say the challenges are significant facing Africa today. We had a difficult environment in the past, but it's been exacerbated by the crisis in Ukraine, obviously COVID, and then these things have knock-on effects. So that's a very challenging environment that they have to deal with. The next panelist will be Landry Senier. Landry, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for giving me the floor. And I would like to also express my gratitude to BPIA and partner, the wonderful team. It's always a pleasure to engage with you and to be to count as one of your friends. So I will first react to Andrew's intervention and then expand a little bit on a broader conception. So first, Andrew, wonderful work as usual. I think the analysis is accurate. So as you highlighted rightly, the slow global growth and actual and coming, the high inflation affecting not just Africa, but also the world, the high cost of borrowing, which is a major challenge on the continent, the deteriorating fiscal condition. Those situations are heterogeneous, but the overall trend is not very positive on the continent. The countries which are at high risk are in distress already, and the slowdown amount order. So, and I also like the intersection or the nexus that we have between the imperative of fighting fires, building resiliencies, or moving away from the edge. So it's a quite political economy challenge because for a leader, for a policymaker, it's incredibly complex to choose whether to address the food crisis or to ensure long-term growth and development. In terms of solutions, so I think that also perhaps except for the sustainable and green growth solution, many of those solutions are quite have come throughout the decades, since the 80s. Whether we speak about when you have crisis on the continent, the imperative of addressing food security or to strengthening public finance and inflation. So perhaps some of the questions that I may have for you before expanding is, so given the marginal place that, of course, per marginal in terms of percentage, because Africa represents less than 3% of global trade. So where will the value be created? Because we are, as we are speaking about some of the solutions, those very important solutions. So as long as Africa remain roles in the global economy, in global trade, remain small, and it is not just small because Africa is not contributing to the global economy. It's also small because value is created outside of Africa with African input. So for example, when Africa trade with the rest of the world, as you know, about 17% of the products which are exported, only 17% are manufactured products, compared to when Africa trade with another, when African countries trade with one another, where over 42% of the products, or about 42%, are manufactured products. So it means that more value is created when the continent trade with one another versus when they trade with the continent. So to what extent do we change the rule of the game in order to address those problems? I think mostly on the long term, because as successful as country could be with the implementation of better quality fiscal policies and strengthening of public finance, amount order, the pie will still remain small to really lift a citizen out of poverty. Also, how do we deal with the high perception premium? So where can value be created when the cost of borrowing is excessively high, when the perceived risk on the continent remain incredibly high? So that's another key question that I think may require perhaps rethinking global finance, especially when it is related to Africa. And also, so where will Africa find resources when we know that many of the resources dedicated to long-term development are now directed to address emergency situation, whether in Africa or in other places of the world? And this is not the first time that we are seeing something like this. I recall when the new Partnership for Africa Development was created, the world come almost as one person to support the initiative, but that didn't last for a long time. When 9/11 happened, the priority has shifted to the fight against global insecurity and terrorism. So how can we really take into consideration that political economy dimension? But that is the external political economy. There's also the domestic political economy, in the sense that some policymakers, although informed sometimes about the proper options, may not necessarily be implementing those. So, and even when some of the resources are available. So we have the global political economy challenge, where global players may not necessarily be doing, adopting the right policy or acting in the way which may be the most productive for the continent. But you also have the domestic political economy, where some actor, again, you have an heterogeneous continent. So I want to insist that you have outperformers, you have shown in the graph. And then coming to the green transformation and sustainable development that you also mentioned. So some recent estimates were providing as number that about 2.8 trillion US dollars are needed to address or to successfully implement between 2000 and 2020 and 2030 to achieve the climate goals. So to what and the continent is only mobilizing about 10% of those resources needed. So when we speak about green economy, the green economy, a sustainable economy, and if we don't think about the resources needed and where to find them, despite the resources provided by multilateral partners, by development finance institutions, by bilateral partners, among other, the gap remains monumental between what is needed to achieve sustainable green economic prosperity and what is being disbursed. And how can we really incentivize the private sector to do more? Because the private sector currently is the one probably doing the least in terms of providing those resources, especially when it comes to Africa. So so those are some of the key points that I wanted to highlight, and this perhaps will serve as a transition to the African Continental Free Trade Area. To what extent can we consider eventually the African Continental Free Trade Area or the continental dynamics or a continental approach to African development for long-term development? So of course, the AfCFTA was, as you know, launched in was signed in 2018. A sufficient number of countries ratified the AfCFTA in 2019. Was supposed to be officially launched in 2020, but due to the pandemic, was launched on January the 1st, 2021. And there are many studies, including by your sister institution, the World Bank, estimating the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area to lift people out of poverty, both extreme poverty, about 30 million, and to increase substantially the income also of people who are just slightly above poverty line, about 68 million. So to perhaps I would have liked to heard a little bit about what option could be continental. And I know, of course, the IMF, the World Bank, and even the US government, when engaging or speaking about Africa, mostly speak about Sub-Saharan Africa. So to what extent could the institutions align also with the priority of African as perceived by African leaders, by the African Union, representing 55 African countries and territories? And to what extent trade, growing Africa trade, could really contribute to a successful, more inclusive and greener African economies? For example, as you know, when we compare the facility to trade of many of the African countries compared to the global average or to some of the other countries, it takes 9 to 10 documents, for example, if you think about Angola or Congo, compared to France, where it only takes 4 documents. You have the challenges related to infrastructure. They require a lot of financing, but on the other hand, the return of investment is not always immediate. And addressing trade is also critical, or harmonizing, having a continental approach, because about 70% of informal cross-border traders, women represent about 70% of those informal cross-border traders, and addressing the obstacle to trade between African countries, but also between African countries, within African countries, but also between African countries and the rest of the world, is probably for me one of the best way to create value sustainably. In my own book, recent book, I estimated to about $16 trillion the combined consumer and business spending by 2050, which could be created successful implementation of ongoing free trade area. I will be happy to. I want to be mindful of time, but what?
I think we may have lost Landry. Landry, are you there? It would be unfortunate to cut him off, but I think in the interest of continuity, Joy, would you like to take over now and make your presentation?
Yes, thank you very much, John, for the opportunity to engage. I'd also like to join the others in thanking the Black professionals in international affairs for inviting UNDP to be a part of this conversation. I do like the solidarity behind this idea of Black professionals in international affairs. And Kolo knows that when she asked me to join this, I think that's really what tipped it in my mind, the curiosity and the desire to make a contribution to the solidarity that is inherent in a force such as this. My reflections would go very much in the direction of where Prof. Landry was going And, thank you very much, Andrew, for giving us the highlights of the regional outlook. These outlooks are often depressing when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa. And over the years in my practice as an international trade and investment lawyer, I've grown a level of fatigue or a dampened spirit about what this means, precisely because we have to find a way to make the shift from, let me put it this way, we have to find a way to valorize understanding the challenge and rather use the energy to pivot towards solutions. And so that's what I'd like to spend some of my time talking about today. When you think about, if you asked Andrew, what is causing this dampened projection of growth? I think the answers are pretty much straightforward. It is really the accumulation of the compounded effect of both COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. And here I'd like to mention a senior colleague of mine, Dr. Raymond Gilpin, who led a team that put together a really insightful report, the impact of the war in Ukraine on Sub-Saharan Africa, that we launched somewhere in April, May. Powerful report that gives and really much shares many of the reflections that Andrew has spoken about. And for me, I'd like to talk about solutions, especially seizing the opportunity of where Andrew was going when he talked about fighting fires, resilience, and coming away from the edge. So fighting fires, very well articulated. Building resilience is where I'd like to anchor. I'd like to pitch my tent there and talk about understanding what both COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine taught us about the inherent fracture in the African economy, and therefore the inherent problematic with the development model that Africa has followed to this point. So when you look at COVID-19, for me as a trade practitioner, what I see is a revelation of vulnerability in the failure of trade policy to contribute to resilience. Because all of a sudden you see supply chains are broken and there is a panic. All of a sudden you see that there has not been an investment in the medical industry. And so you struggle about the reality that you're going to have to sort of scrabble about how to get gloves, how to get PPE, how to get vaccines. At the same time, it tells you that we've not focused sufficiently on investing in an education sector that ensures that where there are shocks, you leave no one behind. And so you see that unfortunate reality that the pandemic, in fact, demonstrated to us what it means to leave many behind when they could not migrate to the digital online learning. And then you see all of these points. So you ask yourself, what could trade have done? What is the solution really? The solution in my mind is about investment in production, shortening supply chains, creating an industrial base on the continent that can respond to those issues. And so what does the war in Ukraine do? The war in Ukraine exacerbates that, not from the perspective of PPE, but this time from the perspective of food and fertilizer. And so you ask yourself again, how do you really build resilience in a situation of this nature? And so I'd like to propose that we think about the core to building resilience as finding that initially intended marriage between both trade and investment and trade and industrialization. And the point really is that it is time to think about, to get serious, to put the foot on the pedal on using the opportunities created through trade policy, trade integration, to step up investment in industrialization. And if we talked about this maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we'd have thought, okay, well, but you see, Africa is so fragmented. You see, there's high tariff walls, high peaks, escalation, lots of NTBs. Much of that is true still. But we would not have been able to say at that point in time, but now we have the AfCFTA. And therefore, I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area is truly a game changer. In addition to the great points that Prof. Landry has said, for me, it really comes down to this idea of creating a model of development that does not necessarily ensure that shocks will not come, but that creates the power of Africa to fight back when these shocks come in a manner that's resilient and in a manner that retains the dignity of the 1.3 billion people that live on the continent. Now, we all know what the AfCFTA does in terms of its ways and means of getting there. But I think we can go to the second question, which is really what is in the bag in this African continental free trade area to answer the questions that can help us to grab that part of the circle that Andrew told us about, that's about building resilience. And at UNDP, we published a study at the end of last year, one of our flagship reports called The Futures Report, Which Value Chains for a Made in Africa Revolution? Because ultimately we're talking about made in Africa and how to bring this to fruition. And so what we identified really is to look at what countries are exchanging thanks to the offers, thanks to the treatment they've promised each other of a preferential nature in their goods and services regimes, because those are the two pillars on which the House sits at this moment. And what we saw is that there's a potential for almost zero for zero tariff treatment in sectors like lithium-ion batteries, automobiles, clothing and textile, leather products, soya, cocoa, vaccines, pharmaceuticals, mobile financial services and creatives. Now, when you look at that, it takes you back to what Prof. Landry was saying, which is this idea that there is a distinction between the profile of Africa's trade with the rest of the world, this 3% that we talk about. And when you look at it in detail, as Prof said, you hardly see value addition. And yet when you turn the table and start to understand what that looks like in the intra-African context, you start to get hope that there is resilience, potential for stronger resilience in that. Prof told us about 40, ECA used to quote it about 48%, UNCTAD too. And therefore, really, we have to make the case to say resilience is about industrializing Africa. We now have the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's not just a treaty floating in space promising treatment. It has the core of a critical promise in terms of sectors. So the question is, how do we connect the promise to an effective capacity building agenda that anchors the prospect of industrialization and brings it to fruition? And here is where I think it's interesting to talk with the institutions that lead on global economic governance. Because once you make that connection, i.e. investments in energy, for example, investments in the infrastructure for trade, investments in the technology that is needed to produce these African goods, then you start to see something that in fact takes us to that third circle that Andrew spoke about, which is moving away from the edge. So to my mind, I think we need a new generation industrial policy. We need a new generation focus on industrialization on the continent. We need a new generation approach to capacity building in terms of the partnership that Africa has with the rest of the world. We need development resources to move away from sort of small projects to the big business of unlocking that potential. And so how does investment then come in? And I'll close on that. You know, we've often had an investment relationship with Africa that can be defined in many ways, but I think we really know that it's about the raw materials. And so how do you use investment as a tool to accelerate the sustainable development? How do you use the confluence between trade, industry, and investment to create Africa's promise? So you do that really by asking yourself, how do we step away from extraction and use the development narrative to build value addition? And I think this is where the promise truly is, that when you think about relationships with countries that are not in the African Continental Free Trade Area, they should see the possibility to create new partnerships that are about investing in Africa, that are about producing in Africa, that are about creating those production processes on the continent, investing, bringing that technology on the continent of Africa, and going through the scale from lint, for example, to apparel, same story across a range of commodities and sectors. Then you start to see something that is truly transformative and something that is truly developmental. So I'd like to close really on this point to challenge us all to say, there is hope. There is hope because we have been here many times before in terms of the prospects of the continent looking dim We spoke before about those years of the tigers, and we saw, the great growth of those, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies coming from the continent. But it's also true that the problems are structural. Shifting from a relationship that we have now to one that focuses on trade, industry, and investment is the way to go. The AfCFTA gives us an opportunity for that. So I'm very keen also to hear Andrew's perspectives on how the loop can be connected.
Joy, I think you're breaking up now. Landry? I'm sorry, Andrew. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay, so a lot to digest there. Maybe to start the discussion off with, yes, we have been doing outlooks for quite some time, and yes, sometimes they do make for somewhat depressing reading. I think part of that is a sense of frustration that the potential of the region is always sort of frustrated by these ongoing shocks that seem to prevent a more strategic investment in things that are necessary, particularly right now. I think I agree with all the comments basically saying right now it is worse than ever. This is part of the thinking behind the living on the edge narrative, is that this is not just a shock. This is a series of shocks, shock after shock after shock, hitting a region that did not have the space to deal with the first shock. And as we know, the cumulative impact of these kinds of things as they erode household buffers, as they erode the ability of people to cope, they're not linear, that you can have a certain amount of shocks and then things get very bad very quickly. So these are the kinds of things that we often focus on in our short-term analysis, but what we often don't state probably enough, because the nature of the product is the potential of the region. And this is always at the back of our mind as we're writing this. And I think we probably should do a better messaging in terms of bringing that out. Big picture, what we see is that I think in the past week, the global population just passed 8 billion people. Okay. Between now and 2050, we're expecting the world to add another 2 billion people. 1/2 of those will come from Africa. This is an extremely young and dynamic population coming at a time when the world needs it most. The rest of the world is a fairly old, aging population that will peak sometime soon. Africa is where the dynamism will come in. Now, in a perfect world and a nice textbook economy, the integration of Africa into the global economy would be obvious and almost inevitable. Okay, aging populations that need young workers, a region with young workers needing opportunities, the integration would happen automatically. But the challenge is actually to make the integration happen, and it's through various things. I think the AFC, the free trade area, okay, is a key step. But to maintain our sense of optimism, we see these big picture framework, and we see that Africa's integration and participation in the global economy as such a positive force, not only for Africa, but for the world. There's a sense that gravity is on our side. And so the challenge is to identify the individual sort of stumbling blocks that's preventing that from happening as smoothly as it should. And to a certain extent, that may involve building up a regional trading arrangement so that Africa as a whole is seen as a much more attractive trading partner, a much more attractive investment destination. Similarly, it involves maybe unlocking private sector funding into the clear investment opportunities within the region. Part of that may involve reforms to the business climate. Part of it may involve partnerships with local authorities and institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or the IFC to find new ways of blended finance, to find new ways of sharing risks that can again remove a stumbling block to allow the flow of funding and investment and growth to happen. And in defense of some of the things that we often propose now, even in our short-term focus. Okay, again, it is very hard to invest in development needs while you're fighting fires, while you're dealing with crises, but there are things that we can do, that authorities can do, to free up a bit of space to help move the process forward. And even in a case where, say, there is no fiscal space to deal with these things, simple, not simple, but interventions that we know have worked in other places, like setting up a medium-term planning framework to give comfort to investors that there is a plan that helps unlock more funding, that helps lower borrowing costs, that does create the fiscal space, that does allow for more investment, which then justifies that confidence. These sorts of small interventions on a whole bunch of different points to our mind sort of help free what we see as a underlying force that will help integrate the region into the global economy. That's my case for optimism, and it's something that a lot of my colleagues share at this end. We have detailed recommendations on different things, but in terms of big picture, why we remain optimistic, why we remain committed to the promise of this region, that's one of the reasons, or one of the best ways I can express that.
Thank you very much for that positive emphasis, Andrew. Joy, do you have a response? And I don't know if Landry is back on or not. Joy?
Prof is back. Should we listen to Prof?
Okay, Landry, you were cut off.
So, sorry, I was interrupted. As I mentioned before, I'm calling from Niamey in Niger. So no, I think that the point that I highlighted, and I think that Dr. Joy and Dr. Andrew highlighted also beautifully, is that those are ongoing conversations. So the idea is to acknowledge the short-term solution, but while renewing our thinking about the long term, because without rethinking development, we will be addressing wounds instead of solving or providing solution for long-term, on a long-term perspective. So I like to put things on the long-term perspective, especially as per UN data. Africa may reach about around 38% of the global population by the end of the century. So we cannot keep using, for the short run, of course, those solutions are very relevant, but how can we really rethink and transform Africa? And I think, as Dr. Joy also mentioned, the industrial policy, how can we create value on the continent? As long as we'll see Africa will remain below or around 3% of the global trade or global export. So where will the resources be coming to implement bigger aspirations? So we need a more prominent place for the continent. And it starts with Africans themselves, but also with the support of the global community, because many of the roles, some which were highlighted, I think, by all of us, the high cost of borrowing, when we know that borrowing is key to create value. So those situations should be addressed on the long term, and that require collaboration with the global north, but also other partners in the global south.
Let me use my prerogative to inject a question. We're talking about industrialization, but as we know, we're entering the digital age. And statistics have shown that the jobs that are going unfulfilled, information technology jobs, are astronomical. And the potential for population growth in the developed world will not meet those needs. Whereas, as we pointed out, 38% by the end of the century will be in Africa, the world population. Should we not think about integrating Africa into the digital age and taking advantage of the youth that are coming onto the job market to give them the skills to work in the digital age and information technology? I throw it out to all three of the panelists.
Yes, I'd like to go fast there, if I may. Just first to share some reflections on the points that were made by Andrew earlier, and really to agree that integration, the penultimate development question, certainly for me, is how do you ensure that Africa's integration is beneficial? Because Africa is integrated into the global trading system. It's just integrated at the bottom. So you supply the raw materials. So we want to talk about models that allow for capturing some of that wealth through value addition. Very important. I'd also like to talk about the importance of ensuring that as these development models or development frames are rethought, we must think about how to get inclusivity right from the start. From the start, which means where are the women? What are they producing? Where are their markets? What are the issues? What are the stumbling blocks they face in particular production processes? And how do we get in there to channel effective trade capacity building? That will inevitably take us away from talking trade theory into supporting industrialization. And I think that's a very important shift we must make. And then when we talk about opportunities in the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have to think about how to go big on issues like trade facilitation, trade infrastructure, trade finance. You know, UNDP and the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat launched another report this year. This one was called The Engine of Trade. And it's really capturing the voices of women in this run up towards the commencement of negotiations on a protocol for women in trade. And what women are saying is a straightforward message. One, we need to understand these opportunities in a language that speaks to us. Two, we need to have access to financing that can allow us to scale. Three, we have to tackle those sort of like regulations that encompass the entire exportation process that are almost engineered to ensure we don't. And then four, we must be let to move. People must move so that trade can continue. I wanted to throw that in the mix and then to share some reflections also on digitalization. To say that, one, I think digitalization is one of those areas where in a quiet sort of unsung way, I think Africa is leading. Certainly when you think about innovation. Because when you think about the whole idea of mobile financial services, you talk about M-Pesa and its multiple mutations. These are African innovations. And the economic activity that has managed to spring off that is highly transformative. At UNDP, at COP27, we launched our Setting Up the Stories of the situations where Africa is leading. And so Africa Innovates, this time we're profiling climate champions that are innovating to solve community problems practically. And so these are stories we must tell. The final thing I'd like to say really is that how do we ensure that the innovation processes taking place on the continent are rooted in supporting production? So it's not just apps. How do we solve the problems of production in agriculture through the wave of innovation that we're seeing on the continent? And so at UNDP, we've established this program called Timbuktu, because if you recall anything about Timbuktu, it is that place where the birth of knowledge, the birth of innovation, the birth of trade took place historically. And so everything from agri-tech to ed tech to clean energy and so on and so forth, we're investing in the power of these young people, trying to tackle the ecosystem so that you go beyond giving them an innovation prize, but rather talk about the policy issues, the regulatory issues, the research issues, and then the financing issues. I just wanted to throw that into the mix. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Anyone want to respond? Andrew and Landry?
So my book, which will be released on February 2023. So in February 2023, is called Africa Fourth Industrial Revolution. The next book, by Cambridge University Press. So I discussed those questions of digital transformation, emerging technology, and the fourth industrial revolution, how they are transforming the continent, the primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector. What are the countries which are leading the way? What are the followers, and what are the strategy for Africa to further capitalize on the fourth industrial revolution. I may do a pro-launch at Davos in January 2023. So definitively, I think that a proportion of young people on the continent are really leading the way and playing a prominent role in digital transformation. But I also want to acknowledge that if we want to create an inclusive, if you want to create really an inclusive transformation, we need to also address the questions of education, primary education, secondary education, because by 2035, about 450 million people, you have about 450 million newcomers in the job market in Africa, and only about 25% of them will find job, and the safer job, only 5%. So which means that 75% of those young people will have to be entrepreneur or will be self-employed among other. And if you have about 75% of the population self-employed, we need those people who have critical thinking, who have strong basic digital skills, among others. So we have to rethink education, to rethink curricula, in order to be certain that we provide to the young of the skills which are needed for the future of work. And of course, investment in higher education is important, and there the private sector should lead the way. But for primary and secondary education, it will really be critical to rethink it and to provide sufficient resources for long-term and sustained development. And when we think also about digital transformation, the fourth industrial revolution, there are many dimensions to take into account. So in an unpublished paper that I have finalized, but which will probably be published sometime in the coming year. So there are different dimensions. When we speak about capitalizing on the fourth industrial revolution, how do we capitalize on the human capital? So that is one dimension, building the skill, quality, healthy skill. On financial capital, where are the resources coming from, and how to make sure that those resources are well used. So you also have the agility, how to ensure that government adopt policy which will match the speed of private sector innovation. So that's another really important dimension. We have the technology capital, so how to not just create an enabling environment for the expansion of technology or for adaptation, but also for innovation, because many of the things that we see on the continent are adaptation of existing technology. How do we do a deeper dive to also have deeper innovation with intellectual property which could be preserved? So that is another dimension that we have. You have the enabling environment, which is key, and we have the digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure capital. Those are also some of the elements which are really important. So among many other elements, again, this is a topic I may want to pause now because I have written extensively about those questions, and I'm certain we'll be happy to read it in my coming book.
Is there anyone, Andrew?
Yeah, not much to add other than to agree with everything they said, especially on the importance of education. But also maybe, I guess, to reiterate that as we think of digitalization, the process of digitalization in the fund, it's not just thinking of it as a sector, although it has that aspects, but often we wrap it up into the broader discussion of inclusive growth, because it is a game changer in terms of enabling a much more richer process of growth. I mean, I see it in a number of other countries that we've worked on, particularly as we discuss improving the workforce participation of women. Digitalization is often one of the key things that makes a difference. It enables access to finance in a way that's not otherwise available. It enables home-based enterprises in a way that's not otherwise available. It connects small-scale enterprises to a global market in a way that we've never ever seen before. And I think we're right. We often see that Africa is leading the way in innovating these sorts of connections, these sorts of technologies to make that process go forward. But I think the rest of the world, I know the countries that I've worked on in the Middle East, a lot of them are watching what's happening in Africa for ideas and ways to move forward in that dimension.
Thank you very much. Joy?
Nothing useful to add. Just to say I'm keen to hear what the audience think, because, you know, if this is largely a diaspora group, they have a leading role to play in getting that investment opportunity and bringing it to the continent, because that brings financing, that brings skills, that brings technology. But that also brings a level of satisfaction that I can imagine is hard to quantify. I did want to say on digitalization that digitalization and industrialization should be seen as two sides of a balanced sort of equation. Because when you think about the role of digitalization in advancing access to markets, for example, as Andrew told us, the other side to it is, what are you bringing to that market? What are you bringing to that digital market? And so in a sense, we really have to invest also in the production of industrial products, services, as we know them. Because when we think about it, we started this conversation with shocks. The shocks were about medical products. The shocks were about education services. The shocks were about food. The shocks were about fertilizer, for example. No amount of advancements in digitalization is going to make those go unnecessary. On the contrary. And therefore, how to really put a foot on the pedal on this production side, a la base, and then use digitalization as an accelerator to advance prospects and speed.
Thank you. Could I ask Kolo, have you been monitoring the questions from the chat? And would you like to take over now and maybe introduce some of the questions?
Yes, so thank you so much to our esteemed panel, and that was really a very interesting and different, I think, discussion. Thank you for bringing in those perspectives. The chat has been very lively, and thank you so much for everybody with your comments. And now we just like to open to those who have specific questions. I know there were lots of comments, but I see Bryant has his hand up. So Bryant, can you take the floor? We'd like to ask everybody asking a question to just be very precise so that we can have as many questions as possible.
Hello, everybody. I have quite a contribution to make. I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible. First, a little bit about myself. I'm international relations and global security scholar. I'm assistant in empowerment and development to a People World Assembly, and I've used my years of global leadership to learn how to contribute to Africa. I'm part of African Union Youth Assembly.
Sorry, Bryant. I don't know if I'm sorry, Bryant. I don't know if I'm the only one, but your connection is choppy. We can't really hear you well.
Okay, I'm gonna try to move outside so you can hear me well.
Okay. Are you still there, Bryant?
He's moving outside. Maybe if there's someone else while we're waiting for Brian to get it.
In the meantime, is there anybody? Hold on, I just saw a question right now. Let me just go back. And Angel Smith says that she studies smart cities and climate policy, and she wonders how we can structure climate policy and climate finance to strengthen and support workforce development. And she also thanks everybody for touching on the role of education and workforce development. Is there anybody that would like to take a question on climate policy and climate finance?
So I think, as I mentioned when I was speaking, I have just released a report on rethinking climate change action in fragile and developing countries. And where with my co-author Ali Mbai, we discuss the key trends in climate change and how they affect fragile and developing countries, but also some of the key solutions that the world could provide that global player could provide, especially advanced economies. one of the things that I want to highlight is about 80% of the people who suffer the most from the most extreme consequences of climate change are based in Africa. Climate change is not just a question of ethics, it's also a question of development. So it's drastically affect the economic performance and livelihood of people. So another dimension is also the connection between climate change and fragility, climate change and conflict, especially in countries where you already have governance challenges. So they deteriorate the condition and exacerbate conflict or turn potential conflict in actual conflict. So those are some of the dimensions. And really, I'm really concerned about the level of financing because, as I mentioned, out of the about 2.8, of course, meaning probably higher than that, but you have various numbers. But the one I prefer is the 2.8 trillion US dollar needed to achieve climate goals in Africa from 2020 to 2030. Only about 10% of the resources are secure or are provided, about some will say 10 or 12%. This is monumental. So although we have a lot of discourses and good intentions, I think without providing the resources needed, we will not have that greener economy on the continent or even worldwide. And there's also another dimension. I was speaking on a panel with Project Syndicate, and many of the panelists were mentioning as a solution to the global energy crisis to consume less energy, to reduce consumption. My reaction was, well, perhaps in advanced economies, but on the continent, in Africa, about 600 million people, so the number fluctuates like from 570 something to a little bit over 600, but let's say more than 500 million people do not have access to electricity. And even if we go further, even the one who have access to electricity, you have regular interruption. And in many countries, industrialization is also blocked due to poor access to energy. So how can we build a just world? How can we ensure climate justice? Ensuring that on one hand, African countries and other developing nations, the ones who have least contributed to polluting, continue to lead the way. But on the other hand, that the ones who are polluting the most also pay their fair in solving those global climate challenges. So financing is key, but also the disruptive technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, with digital transformation, also provide ways to not replicate the errors of the past.
If I may, one of the things that I've been concerned about, industrialization is energy intensive. Would the panel agree to that?
It has been in the past.
Has been in the past. And it's likely to be in the future.
I would say that.
Sorry, go ahead. Landry?
Let me have Andrew finishing, and then I will come to the point.
Okay.
Again, this is something that we're working on right now. Industrialization has been energy intensive in the past, and I would agree with everything that's been said here in terms of the scale of the issue. I mean, right now, I mentioned before that a large part of the population growth going forward in the next 20 years is going to be from Africa. Right now, Africa represents 6% of the world's energy demand. Half the region already does not have access to electricity. As the region grows and as it becomes integrated with the global economy, those energy demands will change. Now, the question is how to meet those energy demands in a way that is sustainable with a carbon budget. I mean, right now, over our entire industrial history, we have a certain amount of carbon that we can release into the atmosphere without tipping over 1.5 degrees. We've already spent like 85% of that. We have 15% left. So whatever happens going forward, it's not going to look like it did in the past. And we do have technologies available right now that are very, very different to what we had in the past. The goal is to basically try and unlock them as we move forward. And in terms of, there are things we can do in finance, but one of the things that we sort of try and stress here at the fund is that, again, given the big picture of what we see, the role of Africa and the needs of Africa going forward, one thing that we stress over and over and over again is that climate change is a global problem. There is no solution without taking Africa's needs and concerns into account. Without Africa, there is no global solution. Given the scale of the change that we're seeing from this continent, it must be part of the solution. And organizations like the fund, like other organizations that have a universal membership, are part of a larger conversation where we can bring the voice of the region to a broader audience.
John, I have a feeling you hadn't finished your question, but I did want to throw some aspects in on the financing question. We just come from Sharm el-Sheikh, where the Africa Corp has adopted a decision to establish a loss and damage fund. That is good news, because when you think about it, that is supposed to go at least some way in creating some sort of financing that can respond to that. The second point is, African countries have spoken about the 4% at most contribution they bring to this challenge, and the need really to at least create fair arrangements around carbon markets, because in there, I think, is a unique solution to the financing question, because Africa holds a lot of those sinks that can sort of sequestrate the carbon, so to speak, when you think about the DRC. And so if you had carbon markets that are operating on fair terms, that right there is a huge resource that can power climate finance. The other thing I'd like to talk about is, should countries need to access financing from multilateral international financial institutions? And the question becomes the cost. What is the cost? And of course, there, the lobby point and the advocacy point is to ensure that it is affordable, to ensure that it is sustainable, and to ensure that it's not exacerbating a debt problem. But then you also have this multicolored ranges of options. And, you know, Andrew, you spoke earlier about blended finance, and UNDP has what we call the Africa Finance Sector Hub. It sits out of Pretoria, and it's working precisely with countries to identify where the multiple pots of resources can be found through an integrated national financing framework, and also supporting countries with the possibility to launch green bonds, for example, blue bonds, and so on and so forth. On the question of access, we just launched at UNDP the Africa Mini Grids program. And this is a very interesting program, because as part of the strategic plan 2022-2025, UNDP has committed to what is the word? I'm a lawyer, I shouldn't forget it. To endeavor to support at least 500 million people get access to electricity by 2025. Now, a large part of those, for the numbers that Prof. Landry gave us, will be in Africa. So contributions of this nature are important. Now, we also know that the type of energy, it's part of the solution. The type of energy that will power industrialization on the continent will require boosts in technology and sort of the creation of those types of mixes that can really allow for a renewable energy powered kind of industrialization. And so efforts must really go into that. And again, if African countries have to access money or from the markets, then the question also becomes the question of risk. Because Africa, I think, Prof, you were talking about that. This perception that it's too risky to lend, to do business in Africa. It's too risky to lend these countries. And so we have to think about also understanding what are the real metrics that go into those calculations, and how do you get fairer systems that credit Africa also for the important reforms that have been done over the years. Thanks.
Are there
All
any
right.
questions?
Yes, actually, I wanted to go back quickly to Brian's, if you would please state your question rather quickly. And yes, Brian, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, my name is Brian Ezeyamama Gubalu. I'm an international relations and global security scholar. I just feel like I have some valuable contributions to make. So first of all, I'll start off discussing Africa, US, Russia, and China. The war in Russia has instigated and has caused a food insecurity crisis in Africa. And also Russia is stealing Africa's resources to fund its war, for example, using the Wagner Group in DRC. This is causing African countries to starve. Africa needs food, and countries are beginning to reduce foreign aid due to an economic downturn. And there's also donor fatigue. These economic and food issues are likely going to be a long-term problem and requires a long-term plan. Africa has a great proportion of the world's arable land, and Africa needs to be more self-sufficient, especially in agriculture. On China, in the past has given massive government loans to corrupt politicians, such as the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, who pocket these loans and leave the debt to future generations. China has bugged the AU Secretariat to spy on the African Union. So China is not a reliable trade partner to the US due to the potential for global conflict. With the potential for conflict in the Indo-Pacific, there will be issues with...
Sorry, Brian, to cut you off. Could you please state your question? Because we'd like to address specific questions to the panelists. Thank you so much.
Well, I had a couple of contributions as to solutions that we could use to fix some of these problems. So that's what I was trying to get to. But...
No, we would like to have questions from the audience. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
Is there anyone else that has a...
Oh, Ada had an interesting question about decolonizing finance. And so she wanted to find out from the panelists what their perception of what decolonization of finance would look like for Africa. So if anybody on the panelists would like to address that question.
So, Andrew, it looks like Andrew, this question may be better suited for you.
I'm perhaps not familiar with the phrase in terms of what it means.
Yeah, I think the terminology needs to be clarified.
Ada, do you want to clarify the term?
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I work with Encompass and our principal partner is USAID. And for almost how many years now, we've been talking about localization and decolonizing aid. So I was in the AEA conference last 2 weeks and I had a section where we talked about decolonizing wealth or finance, and it had to do with Africa, right? So we people elicited the fact that a lot of impact of colonization had impacted Africa and I mean every other place where there was colonization. So they started asking about decolonizing finance. Why do we call it aid instead of reparations? And what are those impacts is going to have in Africa if we stop receiving international aid in quotes? But the argument was this is a way to redistribute wealth. So I wanted to find out from the panel if you've heard about decolonizing finance and what will it be for Africa if this kind of concept continues or holds sway.
I'm not sure the concept is clear.
Yeah.
Maybe the panelists might have a bit different view, but I'm not. To answer a question, you have to have a clear understanding of the concept itself. And that's... But
perhaps, if you allow me, John, so it is true that the concept is, of course, can you see me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, perfect. So it is true that the concept of decolonizing finance or the broader related question are associated with the reform of the global financial system. And perhaps not sure if she will use the same words, but Prime Minister Motes has, for example, made recommendation when she gave the 6th annual Babakan GI lecture on the developing world in a turbulent global financial architecture. And she made many recommendations on reforming international financial institutions, including to cap debt service payment to a certain percentage of export, to reform global credit rating agencies to correct their intrinsic biases that have led global investors to overprice risk in the global south, among other solutions. So I included some of her recommendation in the opening chapter of the development cooperation report that I'm finalizing for the OECD. I think it should be released next month. So it's broadly related to those questions of rethinking international finance in a way that it will serve versus doing the contrary, Africa or developing nation. But Ada, perhaps you may write a piece on your own perception of decolonizing finance.
Unfortunately, we're at the end of our allotted time. We are able to continue if you would like. I think we owe it to our panelists to allow them to leave because I know they have other obligations. If they want to stay around, I'm in your hands. Andrew, Joy.
Happy to stay for a brief while. And I'm still
okay.
Intrigued in thinking over the decolonization of finance angle. I mean, I guess to me, the aspect of finance is a symptom of perhaps a distorted production framework where the investment comes in often into the extractive industries where they can carve out special arrangements or where the risk profile is seen somehow differently. And so the answer to decolonization finance is more homegrown efforts to broaden the set of opportunities. And that's to me is where the free trade area comes in, to build a connected, integrated market of over 1 billion consumers and 1 billion connected industries. That to me would be the first step in making something very, very different, not only in terms of production within the continent, but also the kinds of things that we see in international investors funding. Because as I mentioned, to me, gravity is on our side. We have an aging population around the globe who will save more and more, who will be looking for things to invest in, productive investments. Africa is the key. Almost, yeah, it's the main opportunity. It's a positive, ultimately a positive force for the world, and Africa's prosperity will be a key part of that. Yeah, that's perhaps too positive, and perhaps I'm missing the point, but that's sort of my first impression.
I think the optimistic note is encouraging to hear. I think there are opportunities to make things different. The demographic change is striking if you look at it. As we pointed out, 38% of the world population will be in Africa. These are young people now coming onto the job market, and that's where we need to focus our efforts. And in my view, we need to find growth and job creating opportunities that are not energy intensive, because we do, as long as energy is linked to carbon and the climate consequences thereof, we have to find a way to get growth which is relatively more neutral in terms of energy cost and job creation. Sorry, I don't mean to. Are there any other comments from anyone in the audience or the panel? Or we're at the end, so would you each like to sum up in maybe 2 or 3 minutes each, starting in the order which you prefer? Who would like to go first? Just a final comment from the panel.
So as no one went, I will just say, I think this time is Africa's time. We see the mobilization of African in Africa, African in the diaspora. We have in global institutions, in leading the way also in business. And it is extremely important not to take the responsibility of each and all of us lightly. So I'm very appreciative of the work that you do, BPIA, but also Andrew, the great work that you continue to do as well. So it's always enjoyable to read those extremely important reports. And it should be also a wake-up call for everyone, African and the friends of Africa, interested in making a difference, to really rethink development, to really rethink the relation between Africa and the rest of the world, but also to rethink Africa, what it means to be African. So thank you.
Joy?
Yes, thank you very much once again for the opportunity. There was an invitation at the start to sign up for this Black, what was it again? Black
Professionals,
yes,
Black Professionals in International Affairs.
I'm signing up is what I want to say. That's my point.
Welcome, welcome. We welcome you.
Really to say that I think we live at such a powerful time, because depending on how we treat professors' invitation to rethink development, we sit in a place where we can truly transform, turn the page on a model that has not delivered development for Africa. And so at UNDP Africa, we're really looking at, we've made this shift in our mind, and we look at it as Africa's promise. So we won't focus on being beaten down by the problem. We will focus on identifying the opportunities that the crisis presents. And so we're looking at 6 critical impact areas that we believe will transform Africa. One of them is natural resource governance. Think about if Africa got that right. The second one is sustainable energy. John, you spoke about what kind of power will drive industrialization. We must find solutions to that. The third is inclusivity. Women and youth must be at the heart of all of these levers and accelerators that we talk about. The fourth is structure economic transformation. And through that, the power of the African Continental Free Trade Area to really push a Made in Africa revolution. The fifth is getting Africa to contribute to climate action in a manner that really balances out this idea of making a contribution while accelerating development. And then the sixth one is really doubling down on the question of peace and security. So I'd like to invite you to join us in this new thinking, because I think that something powerful can happen when you think about it in that way. And I'll close also by grabbing that invitation from Prof to reflect on what sort of African you are. I'm the kind of African that's proud to be African. I'm the kind of African that sees the possibility to use trade and development as an accelerator. I know all of you here share a similar story, either as proud Africans or proud friends of Africa. And it will be us who will make that change. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Maybe a last word from the IMF. Again, a theme from the report is this is an extremely difficult time. We've just gone through 2 years of ongoing shocks, and the immediate future is not any more promising. But longer term, again, I think, the promise of Africa still is there. We often end all our reports making that point, is that the potential, the global potential, the potential for the world growth lies in Africa. And as friends of Africa, we do our best to make that happen. I would point out, ending on a ray of perhaps optimism. You mentioned that industrialization is carbon intensive, and that's a concern going forward. Right now, we are building something very new. Even in just the energy sector, right now, wind and solar are the cheapest sources of energy available right now. So however we build a new energy source for this industrialization, it won't look anything like the past. And that is, I think, one of the sort of more promising and to me optimistic aspects of the way that we'll be moving forward in the future.
I would like to thank all of our panelists. I think the final note is, while the challenges are real, we can be optimistic because there are creative thinking that's involved. There are partners that are working together, finding solutions. And the panelists today have demonstrated that kind of solidarity with Africa and commitment to the future and a brighter prosperity for Africa. So thank you all for coming. And thank you very much to our panelists. We've really enjoyed your contributions. Thank you very, very much for everything you've done for making this a success. Thank you, and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you, Cal. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Before you go, Mr. Williams, is there any possibility there will be some kind of like follow-up where we can, connect with some of the panelists?
I will follow up with the panelists and see if they want to share their email contacts with the members of the audience. I think that's a good idea. I think also we can exchange among ourselves. If you're not a member of BPIA, consider joining BPIA and consider working with the Business and Economic Development Committee on these kinds of challenges and opportunities going forward. We have a series of events. We have a series of webinars on entrepreneurship, which we are very proud of. We've had 2, we have 4 more to go. And we are trying to create this kind of dialogue among the members of BPIA, friends of BPIA, and friends of Africa. So I
just put my email address in the chat, but I am on the BPIA mailing list, so I can also follow up that way and try to explore joining the organization.
Okay, well, please join the organization.
An ally as an ally.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.